decide that they want to call.
Well, how about good morning? While we're figuring out those technical issues, we'll push ahead. I'm Mary Jo Hudson. I think everyone's the same. Although we're mixed up a little, which is good. We'll all get to know our neighbors in a different way. So thank you again for coming this morning. Stan, are you going to circulate that?
I think I've checked everybody off. Just as this goes around, just make sure I've checked you off appropriately, and we can go from there.
So we'll have the attendance list go around the table. I will a moment of I guess it's I feel like it's been a pretty bumpy weekend for many of us. Personally, yesterday was a hard day in a number of ways. I'd just like ask if we could have a moment of silence in honor and memory of the folks, the victims in Orlando from yesterday. Thank you. So, our first, I
have them online. I did not print one out.
Okay. I'll pull my board docs up.
It's fairly straightforward. I presented the minutes. They're online, and there's a copy at each seat.
That's fine.
Everyone,
we have our minutes in front of us. They are. This is how board docs pushes out the minutes. So the printed format is a little odd, but does anyone have any questions or comments about the minutes?
They look correct. If you need that.
So do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
And a second?
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good. Do we show?
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much. So I think I'll turn it over to, I think we'll turn it over to Stan. We have some follow-up questions, responses to follow-up questions from our last meeting. Our treasurer, Stan Bahoric, has a presentation on those issues.
I have to go up front, which should drive the audiovisual people crazy. It'll be an extreme close-up. Well, good morning. There were several items from last meeting that arose as questions, and I thought I would do a quick follow-up in response to those. And those 4 items were a little bit more information on abatements, the state funding cap, the charter school funding differential that I mentioned the last time, and what the relative impact of grant funds are. And you should have those presentations all at your seat, and then we'll also post this again on board docs once the meeting has concluded. As I mentioned last week, since 2000, we have participated in about $148 million in foregone property taxes. And I tabulate them for you here in 2 ways. One, historically, on the left-hand side, as abatements have come on the books and the years that they begin in, and typically they're anywhere from 10 to 15-year abatements. And then perhaps, as maybe more importantly, what we track for abatements coming online or expiring and coming to us in terms of new revenue. I highlight the first 5 years because those are the 5 years of our forecast, and that amounts, about $26 million for those five fiscal years. And you can see on an annual basis, a couple anywhere from 800,000 to $2.5 million might come on as new revenue and stay with us. We do factor that into our calculations, so that's already baked in the cake, if you will, into the forecast, but just give you an example of how those abatements will be coming online in the future. On the state funding cap, I put out on board docs a portion of our calculation worksheet. And I've included in there the calculation for all the charter or the school choice options that we had. Now, that's not all the pages in our calculation formula, but I wanted to put out the calculation along with all the calculations for the charter schools so you can see the complexity of that calculation. And in addition, in that document, there will be several line items that you'll see me later pull out to make the calculations for what we get on average per pupil for those two, for us, for the students who come to us and remain with us, and then also what the charter school children take with them when they leave. That differential, and this, I took that form and then broke it down this way. At the very top of that form, you'll see these are the essential, of what we call above the line items for funding. And the calculated funding is that which the formula tells us that we should receive, or I always say should receive. I guess people at the state level have a different opinion about should, but that's the formula calculation, and that comes up with a little over 387 million. But through the state budget process, and they're living within some dollars that they have, they apply caps and they apply guarantees. That funding gets moved around. We are on the cap, and so at the bottom line, we get $296.9 million, about 90 million less than the formula would indicate. Interestingly enough, some of these line items come through from calculated to what we actually received at 100%, and then all these other lines are adjusted for accounting purposes so that we can only add up to 296.8. So the math of it works down this way to give you 387 million in our calculated. It then gets limited to 296 based upon the prior year plus 7.5%, and then they work back up for how we actually account for it. So month to month, when I report to the board, what I've done is I collapse all those lines because the actual allocation to each one of these is a function of a percent to total allocation and not really representative of what we are getting in a calculated sense. So it's a very convoluted way of accounting for our state funding. The bottom line, though, is we're limited to 296, which is 7.5% more than what we received last year. This is the number that I include in the forecast at 7.5% growth out into the future.
Stan, quick question.
Yes.
Is that updated at the state level with the biennial budget? So does the cap fluctuate over course
Yes.
of time? So is it
Yes.
every 2 years or so
Yes.
with the state budget?
Yes.
Okay.
So we know it's 7.5 and 7.5 for this budget.
Okay.
We don't know going forward. We're assuming 7.5.
Thank you.
Pulling data from that report, there's a line on there, it's called our formula ADM of 70,700. That includes the 18,000 leave in charter. So based upon our 296 capped amount, 70,700 children, our average funding per pupil is about $4,200. Now keep in mind, as you look at that formula, there are many, many categories of children, special ed, vocational ed, LEP is limited English proficient, that's okay. So all those different categories have different dollar amounts. For me, to demonstrate this, I simply go to the bottom line, look at the total number of students, divide that into the cap funding, and I get 4,200. Likewise, on that report that's out there on board docs, the community and the community school and STEM, the very last page, at the end, you'll see that total enrollment and the total deduction that they make from our state monies. So they take with them, these 18,000 students take with them almost $142.5 million. And that's about $7,900 per child. So while these students are funded up here at $4,200, that's what we receive in revenue, they then deduct $7,900 per child going out. The math of this is kind of interesting, and this is not a soapbox about charter school funding, but the math is, imagine if all of our children, if all 70,000 children left the district and took $7,900 with them, there wouldn't be enough in our state monies to pay for it. We'd actually go negative. Yes, sir.
And it seems like the number's actually worse if you take the 18 out of the 70 and calculate what's left over on those remaining 52,000 kids. The 296 versus the 142, you're actually getting much less per child that's left behind.
Well, if you reduce this as the divisor, I think that number actually goes up.
No, I take the 296 minus the 142, which is what you're retaining.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's what you just.
Wrong. I wasn't
he said
following
it in
you.
a different way.
Yes,
That's
yeah.
exactly right. We have less than 41.99 per student, the way it's,
What's left over.
right, that's correct.
Stan?
Yes, sir.
How is it determined where to place the caps? And are all districts impacted by that, or what's the formula for determining caps at the state?
It's, I believe, and Eric, you might want to speak to this, but I liken it to, the pie's this big.
Sure.
And you run all the districts through the calculation. And a couple of things I think happen. First of all, you got to get the calculation in the aggregate to fit within the pie.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the different slices and you compare it to the prior year, some districts get more, some get slightly the same, some get less. And then that budget process at the state level takes over. And they make a decision about, well, if we've only got this many dollars to distribute and we don't want anyone to get less than they received last year, I guarantee that money has to come from the other slices of the pie. And therein lies the cap. How they come up with that, I don't know that there's a magical formula.
Yeah, I mean, really what it comes down to is the fact that they look at, they run, you have the calculators, they run the formula based on what's in the statute. And they look at what the prior year, they kind of compare that to the prior year, and they look at what the appropriations are going to be. And from there, they start to work their math, I guess, if you will, to try to put together, okay, we've only got so much in the appropriation line item, we've got what's coming out of the calculated, and then they try to work, they try to, I think from there, they kind of reverse engineer people. They would probably say differently, they would probably make a different argument, but essentially that's kind of what happens, is they figure out, they kind of back into that cap. The guarantee then, certainly helps, that cap helps pay for that guarantee, because if we were in the reverse, we actually, saw a decline in students. It's based on ADM, so it's based on what your enrollment is. I think Stan said it probably very, very eloquently. On the guarantee side, you actually are losing students, so your calculated amount says you should get less, but because we don't want districts to necessarily get less, we kind of bump them back up, so they're not getting anything less than they did the year before.
That helps?
It does, and I know that at the last meeting, we discussed the difference between equity and equality, and the fact that we may channel more resources to certain schools based upon the needs, and that makes sense. And I imagine there's some similar logic behind this cap formula, but I am curious to just have some information to see the impact on districts across the state and just how we're impacted. So if you could let me know afterwards where I can get that information, I'd just like to take a look at it.
Sure. I'll point you to the easily navigable Ohio Department of Education website. And
But Stan, just to boil it down.
yes,
Aren't the urbans treated one way, the suburbans a bit different, and the rural districts have sort of a third calculation?
I don't know that it's that specific. It really, they run every school district in the state through the calculation.
Okay.
And see what they come up with. And they say, how much is that going to cost? Do we have the money for that? And I believe that the dollar amount per pupil is adjusted to make sure that all the calculated amounts add up to what the state can afford. Is that the correct way to put that, or is willing to afford? Then they look within that to see how individual districts are impacted. So,
But not every district though has to share with charter funding though. They don't have to do what we're doing here.
that is correct. We have a rather large number of charter students comparatively across the state. So if you don't have any charter schools, any students leaving your district for charter schools, you don't have that deduct.
Compared to all districts, compared to urbans, we're not disproportionate in terms of the number of students that enroll in charters, so. You just said, I mean, I just want to.
Did I say that? I'm sorry.
But not every district has a charter.
Right.
And I just want to add, taking it up maybe 10,000 more feet, you know, the number or the amount of money that's being budgeted for school funding is really based on the revenue, you know, that the state of Ohio is projecting for itself in the next biennium. So though you have like this, you know, allocation of resources within a pie, the size of the pie really is dependent on, you know, what the revenue projections are.
In collections, that changes throughout the year, so actual tax collections, that will make adjustments to the formula mid-year.
Yeah, there you go, there you go.
And the report that I put out there changes twice a month. And it's updated with a variety of not only funding calculation metrics, but also the deduction metrics as well. It depends on when students are reported, how they collect that data, how fast they get it into the system. We saw an aberration. We saw a mess in 2015 because the data came in late. And so we had another one this year. Some tuition calculations were hitting us very late in the year, and they turned it on, and then they turned it off. So, and that happens within a several-day window. So it's hard to know exactly what these numbers are going to end up being, at least at the state level. It looks great. The formula looks great. It gives you this sense of precision and timeliness, and it's somewhat of a mirage. Okay? And that, again, all available on ODE's website. I pull it down bi-monthly to take a look at it. But it's all retrospective. You get it and you go, oh, great, and the deductions went up. There's not a good predictor of that for us. Okay, so that's that.
I think basically I would just, so my bottom line is first thing, there's a certain amount of funding we can get from the state, but that's capped, so we get less. And then we have to share it disproportionately so per student, we get less per student than what leaves our coffers of that pot of state money to go to community school students. So they get about 2/3 more than the students who are at CCS.
Is there any active advocacy about that disconnect?
There are a number of school boards across the state that have actually sent ODE a bill for their unrealized expenses in the charter school deduct by sending students out of their district to other charter schools.
So it's organized, it's people come together, like-minded organizations.
To a degree, yes.
Well, no, I mean, it's very complex. I mean, the Speaker of the House spoke at a charter school's graduation. It was the keynote for the largest charter in the state. I mean, there's clearly a will to continue.
And it's not so much the continuous, it's just the math that, you know.
I think it's a both and because charters are unable to levy taxes, and that's been their claim all along, but local districts can, and they should have a share of that when they're educating those students.
So they're thinking of it more holistically as
Yes.
a counter argument.
But in effect, they do. Yeah. They don't let, yeah, so it's one driver, and I think a takeaway for us here, it's one driver of why our revenue, our bottom line revenue is lower than what it might be otherwise, because disproportionately we're sharing tax dollars, we're using our tax dollars to fill in for that gap.
There's a structural deficit if you just do nothing
Yeah,
else.
that's a good
This is what drives a lot of the number down.
Yes.
Part of the challenge has been a political fear that if community schools, charter schools are funded separately and apart, that if an administration came in that was not as friendly towards that particular sector, they would simply line out and veto that funding, and then they would all cease to exist. And so part of the reason why we have this deduct system is to allay those fears. I think as time has gone on, as we've kind of moved, we're about 20 years now, I think, into the charter school experiment in Ohio, I think you're seeing some more discussion about how we can kind of move beyond this system of deducts. I think not only from some of the traditional organizations, the OSPAs and the OEAs of the world trying to move beyond this, but I think even some of the community school organizations themselves are starting to say, okay, how can we maybe find a way to move beyond this? Because I think they realize, first of all, it proves problematic in terms of just the accounting function. Second of all, for those who really want to see community schools, charter schools thrive and do well, this helps add to the animosity between that charter sector and the district, and they want to try to remove that, this one other aspect of animosity. So there are some other organizations that are right now saying, okay, let's maybe start having conversations. How can we fund these other than their own separate stream? That, of course, will then lend itself to, well, what does that mean from the district standpoint? Because obviously, if that much is going out, they've got to then figure out a way, how is the money going to flow out? What is that going to mean for us in terms of caps, guarantees as districts? Because we won't have that 70,000 number anymore, we'll have the 50,000 number, and so what is that? There's a lot of questions, and as you start to pull one thread, it starts to unravel a number of others.
I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to be clear about what all we're dealing with. And I think Tim asked an important question about, is there an active campaign or an organized campaign to lobby for I guess, a fair system of distribution? My question is there an active campaign among community schools to challenge the fact that they cannot levy dollars? I know at one point there was a call for all of the money to follow the child, and that there should be a portion of these levy dollars given to community schools. Is that still in place, or is there now, has that dissipated, or?
Eric's our legislative liaison and government relations person. That's why I keep looking at him. Eric?
So, I think that part of what we saw in the last budget bill was the ability to allow high-performing charter schools to, if a school board opted to go ahead and share some of those levy dollars with them. I think that's kind of the compromise where they've landed at this point in time. I think they're smart enough to realize that there are levy dollars leaving right now. If they get the ability to start levying dollars, well, if they start then getting their own money, right now it's a pretty good deal. They don't have to necessarily go to the voters and levy anything. They're still taking, obviously some of these local dollars are coming out. They don't have to worry about that piece. If they have to now start to run levy campaigns and worry about that as well, so there's this kind of they're not being really active, I think, in trying to push really hard that they want to levy their own. I think they found this kind of sweet spot, if you will, with the high-performing. And that's been a theme, the 131st General Assembly, or the high-performing charter schools. We saw that with, as far as the ability to receive the levy proceeds, potentially, the ability to get the right of first refusal for district property. There's some other kind of bonuses and structures that we'll put in the House Bill too for those high-performing schools as well.
Is not the other caveat that public schools can also create their own charters? So that's where law gives us what could be considered an even playing field. Is that correct?
We could apply to be an authorizer.
We can have,
at one time this district was. So that's the other legal caveat here, is that public institutions like ours can also leverage the opportunity via application to become a charter school, or build or create charter schools types of programs ourselves. But Eric is absolutely right. I think the only real movement that we've seen in the charter area that is trying to create some sort of level playing field is accountability. The idea of creating some higher accountability standards that are at least somewhat on even keel with us as public schools. That's, for me, if there's any movement, that's as good as it's gotten. But in terms of the money, no.
And I don't want to belabor it either, but I also want to make certain we don't demonize charters. I mean, Columbus City Schools has a very positive working relationship with high-performing charters in this city. We do a lot of collaboration. In fact, they were involved in our professional development for administrators last week. So there are opportunities just as there are in the health industry with multiple institutions. So.
Well, let me be clear and on record as saying I do not seek to demonize charter schools either. As a former educator, I actually had a sincere interest in creating my own charter school when I was an educator. My question really is to have the information so that as questions are posed to me, I can answer them clearly. Because I can tell you that what contributed to some of the disconnect previously is that at least the voters that I talked to didn't feel as though they had all the information and that they weren't being given straight answers. And so I just seek to do that. So just to be clear on that.
Oh, no, thanks. I appreciate that. I think it's, I mean, what the Finance and Appropriations Committee has looked at this issue a lot and tried to lift it out of the monthly financials and the other reports that the treasurer puts out so that the community can see that of the state money that comes in, we don't, there's some inequity in how that's shared per pupil, and that it's a driver of, it's a drain on some of our the revenue, the net revenue that our district holds. And so the reason again, one of the reasons we're around the table today.
Stan, let's go on to your next slide, which is, I think, the last piece to recap from last week, and it's another puzzle to the funding questions that we have.
Scott and I pulled together the revenue and expenditures for state grants and federal grants and presented that here for the last 3 fiscal years. And to put it in perspective, we then compared that with general fund receipts. The expenditure side looks pretty similar, but we did it on the receipt side here so you can see relative to our overall general fund revenues where they fall. And then within all of our receipts, this is what it looks like. So you see that the general fund is around 800 million. And I think that the state fund, special revenue state, somewhat gets, it's imperceivable in this graph relative to all the other funds. And the federal dollars are up here in the orange. So you can see just as a, relative to all the other funds. Just so you know, this big bar right here is debt service because fiscal year 15 was the year of the refinancings. So we did quite a few refinancings to lower the cost of our debt. That's why that jumps out. That's typically not that large. And then just relative on a percent to total basis, you can see once again that the general fund does comprise quite a bit, and that again, the state and federal dollars, while important, relative to all others, are not that significant. So, but significant in what we can do with those dollars. I think that covers the follow-up from the 4 issues. What is next is the beginning is a discussion of what are listed here is 4 options. We've not given them names. From a financial perspective, I can tell you how they were put together. Option 1 is what we put together for the 5-year forecast. As I told you, there were certain very specific...
A quick question.
Yes.
I'm sorry, just going back. Just need to understand a number, and if you don't have it. So
Sure.
the tax abatements that impact school fund, us getting money, how much a year do we lose in those tax abatements in funding? If they weren't there, how much money would we have? How much more money would we have a year? I saw you, I mean, you had a scale that it didn't really, when I saw those numbers, I was waiting till the end to ask this question.
Yeah.
I didn't get a real grip on how much tax abatements are being given out so that we're losing that because some, it was a moving scale.
Yeah, I was looking at it more in terms of when they come online, and then once we add that in, they stand. I didn't tabulate it, how much is currently totally outstanding. I don't think that's in the chart. I'd have to get that for you. We have all that data.
Do we have to agree to a tax abatement though?
Only certain ones. They have authority to go up to, what is it? 75 and 10 years? 75 and 10 years. If they go over that, we have to agree to it.
Okay.
And there are different gradations of that too, depending on whether it's a commercial reinvestment area or those kinds of community reinvestment area and so on.
And just to follow up, what are the different authorizers of tax abatements? Is it the city and is it the county as well? Or?
You could authorize tax abatements.
It's just city.
Just city that I know of. I don't know that I've run into any others. And the city also has TIFs, tax increment financing, but the city of Columbus makes us whole. They are non-school district TIFs. Not every city does that.
Right, but a tax abatement
It's
for a
different.
new condo
It's different.
downtown wouldn't do that, right? So
That is correct.
the
We're not-
school system is subsidizing in a small sense. That's all I'm just trying to.
But from an
get.
economic, again, we're not to demonize charter schools and not to demonize tax abatements. Understand that typically those properties, while we're receiving some revenue on them, through a tax abatement, you get this development that you might not otherwise have, and so 10 years down the road, those dollars flow into the school district and other entities that participate in property taxes. So I am always reticent to say that absent the abatement, we would be receiving those taxes, because absent the abatement, that property would still be at it might not get developed at all. This is a very highly competitive area in central Ohio. So the city of Columbus has to compete with all the surrounding municipalities to attract and retain businesses. Tax abatement is one mechanism that they have. So I don't want to give tax abatements. We certainly, we have a great
I
relationship
benefit
with.
from that, right? I'm a builder, so.
Oh, well, there you go.
I understand.
I'm preaching to the choir.
So I understand, well, but there's just this balance here, right? Because at some point in time, all of these pieces and parts add up to where we are today, right? That's all. I'm just making a very obvious statement that
Yeah.
all of these things end up getting us to where we are today. And I just, I wanted to know the number for my own benefit, not for anything else. So,
Yeah, I could go back and tabulate.
no, that's
that.
okay. It's not that important right now.
I'll add something quickly that there are areas of the city that are different too. As Dr. Good said, community reinvestment areas. Actually, the abatement is larger, and we don't need district approval. And the city right now just put out an RFP to do like a broad scale, comprehensive look at the incentives that we give out and or the incentive programs that we have to collect data on whether they're useful, if you will, right? I think Stan's point was important that certain incentives are necessary to get the project into Columbus, and that yields further property taxes down the line.
Yeah, I get that, and my only point is, who is the real beneficiary of that? So inevitably, the school system does benefit from it, right? I get that, right? I understand the way the economic engine works, and I don't have this answer, but really, who benefits the quickest should pay the most. But that's besides the point.
That is actually my point, is that we're doing a study right now to really broadly look at what our programs are and are they the right programs for this time right now in Columbus when we have a very hot real estate market. Some of what we're doing may be outdated and a little too abatement heavy. We don't know, but we're not going to make that decision blind. So just to put a finer point on, I agree that the question is important and it involves some study.
And the city also, we participate with the city in a portion of income tax revenue from youth jobs forms. So my experience, been here 2 years, great experience with the development department of the city. It's a great partnership, and those things that were abated 10 to 15 years ago that are coming online now, we benefit from that. And I think the purpose of pointing all of this out, the purpose of pointing out the charter school funding issue, I don't, as the finance person, debate the legitimacy of any of that. What I want to point it out is, A, we're aware of it and we track it. We factor that into our financial forecasting. 2, to show you the magnitude of these issues. And just to help you understand some of the unknowns that we deal with in financial forecasting, so that as we approach the task before us and we look at the 5-year financial forecast, that is not a static document. It is a snapshot in time, and these are several of the many drivers and unknown, and we don't have metrics for forecasting what those numbers will be. So when you see a change or a swing in our forecast, it's my hope that you don't think that I don't know what I'm doing. It's that there are things that are just out of our control that we're trying to put a finger on a little bit as best we can. The state biennium budget. Who in the room knows what the state of Ohio is going to do in the biennial budget in,
It's a year from now.
a year from now? If you know that, call me, because that becomes a known rather than an unknown, and it helps from a financial forecasting. So the point of pointing these out were, as Mary Jo said, drivers in what we deal with from financial forecasting and how things can change rather quickly for us, what we know, what we don't know, and how do we estimate that, and then in fact to let everyone know we are, and I think this was Mary Jo's reference, we are turning over every rock to take a look and see what's going on and how best can we include that and demonstrate that it's an educated guess of where some of these numbers go. Okay, so does that, all in favor of wrapping up the 4 issues from last meeting? And yes, sir. Oh, that was a yes?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Not a problem. What we have next is a discussion presentation on options that have developed over time. I will give you again the financial perspective, and then Dr. Good's going to give you the educational impact perspective. Option 1 is our 5-year forecast. It was developed under a certain set of assumptions, as I told you. No new revenue, only the fiscal 17 personnel number, and then we funded a portion of our capital needs still within the operating budget, but pulled out about $153 million, and we were doing that on a priority basis and doing that such that fiscal 18 would go positive. That's really the beginning of where that option 1 is. We then went back and said, well, that's really not what we want. That's not our aspiration. That's not who we want to be. That's not going to take the district to the next level. What do we need to do next? Well, we need additional personnel items. Dr. will go to talk about that. And what if we put it in over a 10-year period? That's this check mark, FY18 to 26. And in order to help fund some of that, we identified and went even deeper into the capital items and identified more to pull out for alternative funding. So in option 2, you have not only FY17 personnel, but you have a 10-year plan for additional personnel and about $216 million that's pulled out of our operating budget, out of that aspirational budget, if you will, and is now awaiting alternative funding, bond issue or permanent improvement money. Then getting more, I think, in terms of, well, gee, what would you really like to do? This is the finance guy talking, not the educational guy talking. And that is, well, we'd really like to speed up the personnel. We have needs today, and you want to address them in this 5-year period or 10-year period. So what if we accelerated that into 5 years? So the only difference between option 2 and option 3 is to do that personnel plan over 5 years rather than 10. And then option 4 represents that full, if we could do it all today, that might not be the right way to put it. Dr. Good will clarify that. But that gets you to the 5-year personnel plan and funding all of your capital needs as was developed through our budget process that Scott and I talked about the last time, funding all of that through operational dollars. And so I think we'll get some more detail on the impact of these and some more numbers.
If you would, the bond PI, just to interpret for everybody, PI is Permanent Improvement Fund, so it's a piece of that. And then I think in the presentation, what goes into the 153 million and the 63 million will also lift out. Mm-hmm. Does the presentation describe permanent improvement, or do we want to just describe that briefly?
Well, we have left that to a discussion of how do you really want to fund your capital. Permanent improvement is designed for shorter lived capital items. It's typically pay as you go, although you can't do some upfront borrowing on that levy. A bond issue is you think of like 20, 30-year lived assets that you issue bonds to pay for right up front, and you fund that and then pay that off over a 30-year period. So it's just two different types of funding mechanisms, pluses and minuses to both. Scott?
And I'm just thinking, just to clarify, on the permanent improvement, that's how it's defined in statute. A lot of districts will refer to it as a capital improvement levy. It's PI levies are what's in there. So by no means is it by default permanent, but it could be. It could be a tax issue that is levied for a continuing period of time. It's just, in law, it's called permanent improvement levy. But some will, for marketing purposes, use it more, refer to it as a capital improvement issue.
So for permanent improvement, that's shorter term issues that stand. So things that could go into that might be technology, could be school buses, could be books, that type of thing. And then bond being longer term would be more building renovations or new builds, that type
Boilers,
of thing.
HVAC stuff.
So where would the ongoing capital needs of the district be, say for building maintenance? Is that an existing operating budget, or
that is the existing operating budget? Yes.
Okay.
If the district had a PI levy, we have a $500,000 PI levy dedicated to the OSFC project buildings.
And that is the new buildings.
The new and newly renovated buildings that were
Okay.
done as OSFC projects heretofore. And that's a $500,000 levy that is reserved for those buildings. If we had another PI levy, that would be a source of funding for ongoing maintenance needs. Absent that, it's operational.
Okay.
So if we know a roof, for example, and then this was an issue the Finance and Appropriations Committee lifted up and said, the district right now is not planning ahead as well as it could from a fiscal standpoint. If we know a roof has 10 years left on it, we could set aside money in operating, but also if we had a permanent improvement fund, it would be kind of a revolving fund. That's how I understand it. But it's all, we can plan ahead with those dollars and say, okay, we know we'll have X amount of money in 10 years in that fund, and that can be dedicated to that roof we know that isn't going to make it beyond that time.
Keep in mind, we run funds, think of them as checkbooks, and each checkbook stays separate from the other checkbooks. And so a permanent improvement levy goes into its own checkbook. And the dollars go in, and you can spend them on permanent improvements. If you don't spend all those dollars, there's a balance in your checkbook, and that goes to the next year. So for instance, if we had because the math is easy, a $1 million permanent improvement levy, that would generate close to $9 million a year. So $9 million would go in, and then Maurice would want to spend $29 million. We said, no, Maurice, you have $9 million in permanent improvements. And if you only spend $8 million, that million stays over, and then there's $10 million the next year. The key is, if you have that permanent improvement, the key for me is that we can say to Mr. O, come up with a plan over time that addresses those ongoing maintenance needs and those ongoing capital improvement needs. And that funding is there, and it's not subject to other budgetary issues. And we can have that plan set up, yes.
Because currently, right now, we're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're using general fund money and some other money just to upkeep our buildings. And we're putting Band-Aids on some of our buildings because we don't have the funding to do what the need really is. And I think the public needs to know that. We show these fantastic brand new buildings, but as a taxpayer, I want to see and know that that kid's in that building that needs a new roof, or the floor needs to be redone, but we can't do it because we don't have the funding to do it. So if the public understood that that permanent bond money was to keep it up and kind of explain, it's just like putting a new roof on your house, you have to eventually do that. We cannot keep putting Band-Aids on these buildings and expect to not go back to the public to say we need help with them. So I don't think the public understands that that's what a permanent bond is for. When we hear it in the community, we think, oh, another building, oh, another staff administrator, another group of people to come hire. No, they need to understand, this is to upkeep what we currently have and to keep up what we just built. And that's not explained very well in the community.
So later in the presentation, will we talk a little more about the nuances between the different options?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's a great segue. Maybe we should go there. I wanted to just make sure everybody had kind of an overview of what the jargon meant
Yep.
in the summary, and then we can put more meat on those bones as we go in the next part of the presentation.
Yeah, the only commentary I have to add to this is there is a popular term in my business called a reserve study. And what a reserve study does is it looks at what the capital and the improvements to a building over a 20-year time frame. You know, parking lot, roofs, and then what it does is you escalation, interest, and all of the things that are associated, and you have a dollar amount per year to do exactly what Louise, I'm sorry, Lois, I don't have my glasses, is talking about. So I'm not advocating doing more work, but I'm just saying,
Keeping up.
in the nonprofit world, you know, it's something that I've been pushing for quite a bit, okay, about trying to understand what the reserve study is so that, you know, people that donate to a cause understands that for us to operate every day, you know, a roof is only going to last 12 to 15 years, and we're going to have to replace that, and we're going to replace that. You know, we have to, you know, budget. I'm sure you guys do something like that, but that's the terminology that's commonly used in my industry, is that reserve study. And it might be a more politically sensitive term than ongoing capital improvements or maintenance and things like that. So just keep that in mind.
But it sounds like the School Facilities Commission, that $500,000 set aside for the buildings that are being funded with that is supposed to address, right, the capital needs over the long term. So maybe they've done a reserve study at some point, but there's also the buildings that were funded with local dollars, you know, and whether or not the $500,000, you know, covers those facility needs as well, or if there's like deferred maintenance issues in the long term.
I just have a quick question. Can you explain the differences between option 3 and option 4, so we're accomplishing the same goals with different mechanisms?
I think that's going to be the,
coming up?
no, that's a good, that is like a good question.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, that's why I asked the question, will we address the nuances between the options later in the presentation? I looked through and I saw that there's supposed to be some additional discussion, right?
Yes.
So I have a couple questions in that same regard. I'll reserve them until the end.
Okay.
Yeah, you're all, these are all great comments, because now you're coming to struggle with budgeting in the school finance world. And you know, how do you do the capital improvements?
So before we leave this slide though, if you look at the last two lines where it says bond/PI, which stands for permanent improvement, those are two different things. A permanent improvement would be a levy. It wouldn't be a bond issue. I mean, it's like an operating levy. So you can't fund your permanent improvement through your bonded dollars. Those bond dollars are for capital, you know, yes, exactly, long term. So I think it's important to remember when we get to that conversation. Because it almost looks like you could put both together in a bond issue, but you can't do that.
Well, I think we all have questions, but let's move on with the presentation, because I think some will be answered as we dive into more detail between Stan and Dan.
All right.
You want me to stay here and run this for you?
Please, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
And whenever you want me to, I'll step in front of the lens.
So even though my part's the most important part, I'm going to be fast. So I'm going to look at this holistically. You remember at the last meeting, we talked about the district's overall vision, their new vision, and the 3 modified goals. And so we've organized, per the committee's request, by those 3 goals and some outcomes associated with each of those goals. So this is the first goal, and you see the outcomes there are more progress in reading and math, and obviously getting students ready to earn a job when they graduate from high school or go on to college after they get out of high school. And we look at that a couple of different ways, through early childhood education, through improving our literacy and our numeracy efforts, so reading and mathematics, making certain we begin to introduce students to career pathways in middle schools, and then make certain they have those rich, relevant pathways to careers once they're in high school. So you may have read about the Health Sciences Academy. We have STEM programs. We have performing arts programs where they're actually applying knowledge versus sitting and getting knowledge out of a textbook. So we know that students that participate in those pathways to careers actually stay in school, graduate, and then go on to either jobs or to college, military, or to starting a business. So to do that, on the next slide, we've put 2 different things here. So at the top are the staff. So these will be operating levy eligible things, and I'll give you some numbers. You can jot them on there if you want, but we're not held to those numbers yet necessarily, because this committee may come back and say, too much, Dan, you need to revisit that. I understand that. So to achieve those career tech goals, we've actually added 16 positions over the course of either 5 years or 10 years, depending on the committee's preference and the board's outcome. Early childhood education, there ends up being a total of 15 teachers, but then we have to add 24 instructional assistants, because you have to have an assistant when you have a preschool teacher. There are 3 different exceptionalities we recognize in the district: all protected classes, English as a second language students, our gifted students, and our students with disabilities. So you see that 3rd bullet, English as a second language instructors. We anticipate the addition of 24 of those over the next 5 years. And again, we have to have instructional assistants by contract to support those English as a second language instructors, so it'll be 24 and 8. Gifted specialists, we anticipate 40. We've undergone a robust effort to address the disproportionate identification of Caucasian students when compared to our overall student body demography. And so we have new assessments that indicate less bias when it comes to determining giftedness. And we've also, we're operating skill building classes in the primary grades in particular at our most disadvantaged sites. So we do anticipate the need for 40 gifted specialists over the next 4 years. We have higher education coordinators. I left that blank because we would actually be able to fund those through the Educational Service Center. It's part of our contract with them. So, yay, there's a cost efficiency, right? So, instructional assistants in priority schools, I spoke about this a little bit last time. We have 16 priority sites. Next year, we're going to identify a 17th site that really isn't chronically poor performing, but it's almost 90% now limited English proficiency, ECAN is. And so we're going to put that in there. And what our faculty and staff have said is it's that additional set of hands to help break down the ratio of students to teachers, operate small groups, do tutoring, assist just in the daily logistics, what we call executive functions for students, how to get to the office, how to get to the restroom, those sorts of things. Students coming from economic disadvantage oftentimes don't have the benefit of some of those life skills, those executive functions when they come to us. And so that's what instructional assistants do. We projected 58. That will mean there'll be 1 instructional assistant for every 2 teachers. And we ramp that up over time. We start with the primary, which are grades pre-K or K through 3, and then over time 4 through 6. And then intervention specialists, always a need, 63.5. We have good trend data on that. We're now fully compliant in that area and anticipate that should be a pretty accurate reflection. So those would be things that could appear in the operating levy, in the bond issue, or a permanent improvement levy, whichever the committee elects or the board elects. There would be computer hardware and software. Obviously, we need to continue to refresh. We still have some hot boxes. So if you even look around this room, I think in that room back there, you see some of the big old, they look like old televisions. So do you remember the old Commodore computers? Maybe not, I'm that old, but anyhow. We're trying to go with thin clients now and make certain we have more mobile devices. Our goal, once again, is to have a 2-to-1 ratio, students to mobile devices. And we're looking at this next year as being one of the first districts to do a loan program. So we're going to be piloting that over this next year so that to address that digital digital divide. You address that a couple of ways. It's not only putting the devices in the students' hands, but making the buildings, laboratories available to the community after hours and on weekends. And so in our newly constructed or renovated sites like Stewart, you'll notice that the library doors open up onto Schiller Park, and that's secured areas. So once we have safety and security and supervision and structured activities, we could open those doors after hours, evenings, and students could access those. So software, there's a lot of, you've heard Vice President Cole talk a lot about blended learning. There are many, many, many tutorials now. We have Alex this year that students seem to love. It's a math tutorial. It's very customized, so depending on the response the student gives, it adjusts the tutorial to make certain they're developing the cognition necessary for the student to grow. Instructional equipment like laboratories, science laboratories, different simulations. We provide textbooks, wireless access. Those are no-brainers. So moving on to goal 2. The district, this one really addresses the safety of all of our environments. And obviously, you're going to see in this a lot of facility needs as well, because our facilities need to be safe, number one, from an infrastructure perspective, but then we also need to address other kinds of safety needs. So the physical safety of students, the social emotional safety of students, and also working with our staff to develop their cultural competency so that we're not unintentionally disadvantaging students to move forward, and so you'll see those in here. We're also looking at cultural competency through 5 different lenses. So we talk about outcomes. So the expectation is that we no longer have disproportionality when it comes to looking at the makeup of our student body when you look at their achievement results, or when you look at the identification of students that are gifted, limited English, or students with disabilities. It should be somewhat proportionate to the makeup of your student body. It currently isn't. Discipline should be the same way. Representation, so our after-school extracurricular, both the interscholastic sports and the non-interscholastic sports, again, we should have similar representation to our overall student makeup, and then our graduation rates. So those are also part of that cultural competency, and in order to get there, we have to look at the social emotional well-being of our students. So if you go to the next page, you can see in there, I'm just going to jump right, we haven't landed on a number for counselors because the need from our faculty and staff and families have said social workers is their highest priority. So I'm going to skip to information technologists, again, with more language or more blended learning opportunities. We need more individuals that can actually support our faculty and staff in growing their use of that and implementing it into their daily instruction. We are seeing now the evolution of our industry turn from teachers to education facilitators. So we know that students are much more self-directed as early as age 6 now. If they can identify the target, they can typically identify also the pathway, but they do need that ongoing coaching while they're doing that. And it doesn't come from a computer, it comes from a live person. We also know that from some of the online exclusive provisions in other providers. So the 10 information technologists, licensed school nurses, our goal would be to have 1 full-time licensed school nurse in every school, but obviously we take a look at early onset diabetes, we take a look at the number of students that have asthma. I indicated at our last meeting, we have medically fragile sites, we have behavioral handicapped campuses, so it isn't a one-to-one correspondence building to licensed school nurse. We actually distribute, there's a manual Scott put together about this thick, and you look at all of these different variables, and that's how you determine the staffing. But 39 would bring us up to what we believe would be world-class. Safety and security staff personnel, 10 additional there, and social workers is 90. That's our largest number of any one classification, but definitely a need as we try to reach out and again support lifting up the whole family, not just the student as the unit of change. Understanding that even with legislation that we advocated strongly for, now when a student is chronically absent 10 or more days, a team comes together, and that team is no longer made up of just education personnel. You can have your Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority there, you can have the ADAM board there, you can have the health board there, you can have the magistrates there. So it becomes this more holistic, supporting the whole child focus. But we do need social workers that help understand how to facilitate those conversations and also connect our students and their families to the provisions that are in the communities. And yes.
Is there a way to say what the number is now from
23
from X to, as you're giving the projected?
I can do that for this one, 23 to 90.
Yeah, okay. And I know that some it might be tough.
Okay, I'll certainly get that out to everyone.
Is it 90 plus 20?
It is. It's 90 additional.
Okay.
So. So custodians, we're looking at an additional 20. I don't know what the current number is, but why don't I create a little spreadsheet and send that out to everyone so you can see going from what to what. Carpenters, electricians, and plumbers, again, these are needed to make certain the buildings are actually physically safe for our students. HVAC landscaping specialists, there's in that first category, we had the addition of 7, in the second, the addition of 4. Human resource specialists, 2. We actually operate kind of a satellite for Civil Service Commission in Columbus City Schools because of we have 800 employees, and it makes sense to do that. And it would be a burden to the Civil Service Office if they had to do that for us. But those 2 additional specialists would support us there, and then we have 3 additional transportation personnel.
Before you,
Yep.
on that, just the human resource piece, it's very small, but
It is small.
we do collaborate with the city then
We do.
on those services. So that does, we do leverage the city services and not duplicate that.
And we're actually recreating it all together. It's an old model. The decision was made decades ago to shift that satellite work to Columbus City Schools, back then CPS. So we're reimagining that in a more efficient, effective manner.
Can I ask you a question about the transportation personnel? Is that administrative or?
No, they weren't. These were, one was a dispatcher, and I'm trying to think of what the other 2 were. Maria, do you remember? Maurice, do you remember? All 3 are dispatchers? Yeah. So routing, we should take a field trip to our routing office someday. It's a room about this size, and it's all whiteboard, and every student's name and every possible route's on the wall. Keeping in mind that 20% of our students move out or move in every year, so it's constantly dynamic. So we're constantly changing routes, and a lot of our families, believe it or not, in the 21st century, still don't send their kids to school until after Labor Day. And they see the yellow buses running, but in principle, damn it, I didn't go to after Labor Day, and they're not going either. So they come after Labor Day, and we're shifting routes, and you've all read, and you will read infinitum till the changes we have to make after school starts. But this will help address that.
Okay, so that is not about the driver
No.
shortage issue?
No, the driver shortage issue, we already have the FTE approved. It's just actually having the bodies in the seats. Yeah. And we have some good plans for that. We've been to Detroit now. We go to Columbus Castings. So where we see where they're doing layoffs, we're making certain that we're present and offering them opportunities. We're also training our own now through our career tech programs. We have students that participate in college and repair. They graduate, we can hire them back to work here. CDLs, commercial drivers, can't do that because you have to be older than our high school graduates are. Almost all our high school graduates. Yeah.
So throw a commercial in. We're hiring drivers. Call a friend, a family member, have them come and put in an app. It's not that we don't have the FTEs, we just don't have people applying, but it's just not Columbus. We've had lots of meetings and it's all over the state of Ohio. But send a family member over to get a job and then you get kick them out of your house. We're hiring bastards.
So even at central enrollment, when families enroll children, we work with ODJFS so that families that are looking for TANF dollar support, we're making certain they're aware of these opportunities. The wages will continue to be an issue because obviously that impacts the TANF aid. So we're talking about that as well. Moving on to so those are the operating pieces. The next pieces, I really don't need to probably go through this. You can see some of the same sorts of things you saw before in terms of computer hardware. What else we got down there? There's school bus replacement, security equipment. We're looking at some pilots now where students each actually have an ID that they swipe as they get on a bus, so we know exactly where students are all the time. We didn't implement yet because we want to look for an efficiency. Is there an opportunity to combine their point of sale IDs, which they use for lunch counts? Even though we don't charge for lunch, we still do count students. And if one ID would serve that purpose, serve as their student ID, would allow them to swipe into the buildings as well as swipe onto buses, we think that would be a better investment than just investing in one tool right now for buses and then down the line having 2 additional IDs. And we all know what students do with IDs, and you all know you did it too in high school. So we have to figure out how to make certain they can't be duplicated easily. So.
I'm so old I didn't have an ID in school. So the school bus replacement, could you talk about that a little bit more?
Maurice, can you help us with that school bus replacement?
In our school bus replacement, we have a plan that's been moving on. We have a 12-year replacement plan. If you look at some of our buses, we have about 25% of our buses that's over 25 years old. Traditionally, you try to replace the bus in a more frequent manner. Also, if you recall, several years ago, we purchased about 300 buses. So again, that replacement is going to come up all at one time. So what we're trying to do is stagger our replacement of buses over a period of time. We've been fortunate enough to have a great, the other maintenance department has been able to keep those buses together. With the stringent inspections coming up and the change with the highway patrol, it's important that we start implementing a replacement plan so we can maintain over a period of time.
They do a great job. We've had 100% success on the first inspection in the summer in the past 2 years, so I've been really pleased. But I will tell you, when I came to Columbus, I shuddered when I heard that the district purchased 300 buses in 1 year, because I mean, all of you from the business perspective know you have to have some sort of a cycle of replacement, and we shouldn't have that that cliff that when all 300 come due at the same time. So I love the plan.
And actually, Dr. Good, I was going to mention that for Bo and I and others who've been involved for a while with these type of committees, it seems as though things like bus replacement or just ongoing building maintenance are the things the district has historically put off. So really just want to make a comment about, it's great to hear that on the bus replacement schedule, you have a plan. I think that goes in the fiscal accountability category.
Yes.
And the other thing that was called out that I mentioned was this ongoing building maintenance. So a number of folks on the committee made comments about we can't just focus on the new builds and the renovation where the state funds are leveraged. It's really this ongoing asset of the buildings, and Jim's comments I thought were really good to understand what that need is. So I think the committee will be looking for more of those type of comments around where do we think we've turned the corner and we have a plan, and where are we still playing catch up.
So the third bullet there on that slide is a good example. The facilities infrastructure maintenance. I mean, the estimates we throw out there are $50 million in deferred maintenance. It's really more like what, $250 million, Maurice, I believe. And for that very reason, Chad, we needed to have Chair Jester, sorry. We needed to have a plan. For example, if you drove in front of Centennial High School, your car, we actually have a parking lot now that's a grade lower than the rest of the surface because of the potholes. You could just park your car in those. And that was a little joke. So anyhow, but even the asphalt, the surface replacements are now on a cycle so that we're not in this position, or Columbus wouldn't be in this position again.
Yeah, just a quick comment again on school buses. So I did say fiscal accountability when Maurice made his comment. That's a safety issue too for our students. I mean, the district runs a huge transportation system, and with open enrollment, we have students crossing from one part of the city to the other, and the ability to execute that well in a safe environment on the buses is vitally important.
So how much though does this budget, it's my understanding that various proposals, there was about just about 40 million in deferred maintenance that was included in this.
Is that correct, Maurice? Do you remember? Yes.
The goal was to replace 79 buses this year.
So the other one to point out, the safety communication devices, again, when we're beginning to think that students are safe in school, but we want them to be safe till they get home as well. So those two-way communication devices are really important. We have wonderful, wonderful partners in some of our neighborhoods that are doing walking school buses now. So they gather at the end of the day, adults do, and they walk the students to their homes. It would be nice to be able to equip them with those communication devices so when there are concerns, they can radio back and our additional safety and security personnel can be dispatched to support them and address those issues. So, all right, well, last one, goal 3, was really all about accountability. We know that our community, they've begun to recognize that we're doing a better job, we're more transparent, there's greater accountability, but they want to continue to see that and want us to continue to focus there. And so if you look at the next page, we've got just a few investments really. A lot of the work that we can do for accountability is through software. So the board will entertain at their meeting next Tuesday a new software package. So let's say a student doesn't come to school today and the attendance secretary marks them absent, but then got interrupted. Somebody comes in with a runny nose or bloody elbow, or a parent screaming, or a teacher needs something run off, all of which happen about every minute of the day. And so they aren't able to code in why the student wasn't absent. This software software then would generate an automatic notice to that secretary within 24 hours that we're still waiting on you to input that piece. So that's a part of it. It's not only data that was entered incorrectly, oftentimes it was data that wasn't entered because we ask so much of so many of our personnel. So also, keep in mind, with those additional licensed school nurses full-time, a secretary could actually do the secretary's work. They wouldn't necessarily having to be crossover into other classifications and categories and do that work. And they'd be able to focus, and we anticipate our accuracy would be increased more than it is already. So we're looking at, for accountability, we're looking at an investigator and an additional compliance officer. We've had some conversations recently about the needs for investigators. We're a large organization, just like many of yours are, and there are times when we have to take a deeper look into the practices and interview other persons. And that isn't the internal auditor's role necessarily, unless it's related to assets and so on. But we had a conversation last week with the internal auditor, and her recommendation was we look at investigator probably on our side of the shop, along with an additional compliance person to make certain, again, we're dotting all those I's and crossing all those T's and being very transparent and accountable for our work. But a lot of that could be accommodated through computer systems. So we only had an additional 4 of accountability and internal audit personnel, and then the bigger investment would be in those communication systems and the computer hardware.
Before you go on to the next slide, I'd like to go, can we go back to goal 1? I had two other things of questions. We'll go back to this list right here.
Okay.
So the first one was the intervention specialist. Could you talk a little bit more detail what that?
Sure.
That's a large.
Students identified
increase.
with a disability can be classified in any of 6 categories. So the first category, for like a speech language disability, a lot of our early learners haven't yet learned how to do what they're called alveolar slurs, putting your tongue on the top roof of your mouth to make a consonant. So you're all sitting there now trying to put the tongue on the top of your mouth, trying to see if you could do that. So that could be a disability, and sometimes students have an individual education plan for that, and that individual education plan requires that an intervention specialist provide intervention. And so it's a highly specialized skill, and only those with an intervention specialist license are permitted to do that. It doesn't mean that the intervention specialist would be working with the student necessarily. They could be consulting with the teacher, helping them modify their plans, accommodating the student's needs. So that's at the low end. At the high end, category 6, maybe those students I referenced that could be at Columbus Iota or Beatty Park, 2 students where students that have been identified with some emotional different ability or disability really, or it could be at Coleraine where they're medically fragile, so they're very deep in kids, require a lot of support. So you think at Coleraine, you go through, you'll see students on respirators, with G-tubes, wheelchair bound, they have a one-on-one that works with them, gets them to and from. But it's very exciting when you go to our completer ceremonies at graduation and these students are actually getting jobs, and many of you around the table are hiring them in your own institution. So they become independent and productive, but without that intervention specialist support, we would be doing what we did when a lot of us were in school, and we would be warehousing children that really can contribute and be independent in this world. So that's 63.5. We underwent a significant corrective action plan with the Ohio Department of Education and came out on the other end as the model for urban schools in the state, and now they're looking at that as a national model as well for how we identify, support, and sometimes even address those disabilities so that students then can be taken off their IEPs and no longer identified or classified.
Can I use just one quick example? One clear example of that would be my own son. My son started off speech delayed as a pre-K student, went to Wyland Park, went to the Schoenbaum Center, and then kind of bounced between the Schoenbaum and Wyland Park. He had an intervention specialist who worked with him on his speech, who worked with him on sounding things out. Today, not only he is not off his IEP, he started school in an immersion school, first and foremost. So he started kindergarten in an immersion program. Secondly, he's transitioned on to become a 3.3 student at Indianola, K through 8. These intervention specialists, these types of things that provide those resources are tremendous to helping these children realize their potential very early in life, when many parents, my wife and I are both very educated people, but we struggled a great deal initially in working with him and trying to get him to move to next. But it took those things happening on a day-to-day basis to provide that stronger foundation for him that's got him to where he is today. Another piece about gifted specialists and also intervention specialists, just to connect another dot. For the past 2 years, I've worked at the J. Ashburn Junior Youth Center. I have a student there. His name is Adrian. Adrian has been identified as high cognitive. This kid tested off the charts, and he's African American at that, right? So the district, because of that effort to identify other students of color as gifted and talented, did so, but he also struggles with emotional disabilities. So this is a child who is trying to learn how to control his temper, trying to learn how to manage his emotions. But he's also been identified as high gifted and talented, high cognitive gifted and talented. This is the kind of melange of students and situations that we deal with every day that make this growth in our learning community all the more important. So when you guys go out and you're talking to your friends and your colleagues and families about, well, what is this all about? This is really ultimately about growing our learning community first and foremost, whether it's the janitor to the intervention specialist to the nurse. It's growing that universe to create to stabilize a district, but also bring us to next. This is bringing us to next. I just wanted to take a short time to say that.
Thanks for sharing.
Can I ask why the 0.5?
For which one, I'm sorry?
63.5. Is that, do you have part-time?
We do.
Okay.
We do. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is it
We're gonna
really
slice a
63 or is
person
it
in
really 64
Yeah, and we actually asked them to take a look at that trend data. So part of the staffing model, I mean, it's not a good use of your time, but maybe it would be if you have a deep interest in that, to look at the staffing metrics now. It used to be you would just automatically increase X% across every line item in your budget. But we really began to look at what are the needs and how do you align the treatment to the needs and what does that translate to in terms of personnel and then other expenses. And so that's how we build our budget now for the next 5 or 10 years.
And then additionally, based on the different disability categories, there might be a different pupil to teacher ratio. I have 4 MD units for multiple disabilities, and so for them, there's a max of 8 students per unit. I also have a high incidence classroom that has a max of 15. So with that variance to that, adjust the requirements for the staffing.
And the good news is we do a good job with our students with disabilities. That was an area where we got a B as opposed to an F in the past. So in terms of value added, so those students are achieving that much higher. Same is true as gifted. We got A in that area, and then for the lowest 20% of our students, we got an A in that area. So we're doing the right things. Our goal is to continue to do it. We do anticipate there will be students that continue to move back and forth between other providers in Columbus City schools, but ultimately we have a slight uptick in enrollment over the next 5 years as projected by the enrollment study. So.
Can I close the loop on the intervention specialists? That the number, the 63.5, most of that, as I understand, is fixed because of the consent order. That we have to do that one way or another. Is that?
I wouldn't say it's the consent order. This is actually the compliance piece. We're already in compliance now. This is what we anticipate to be the appropriate ratios, like April pointed out, of students to needs. So.
And another quick.
You know, the other hard part, though, I'm sorry, about doing a good job is then when you become the district of choice, then parents of students with multiple disabilities say, hey, Columbus is doing a good job. We're going to relocate there, pay lower taxes, get greater service. And we have very interesting conversations with the ring districts, the suburban districts, that may say, wow, we don't really have a program like that. By law, they have to provide it, but for a parent, do they want their child to be the first in a pilot in that district versus going to like April's school that could do a marvelous job for the MD students. So, but we are fully compliant now.
Okay, great.
If I may, just a couple quick questions. In the 63.5 intervention specialist, does that include occupational therapy, physical therapy, and speech?
It does, yes.
And then so of the 63.5, a number of them would be classroom teachers. Is there Instructional assistance for those special education classrooms contained somewhere separately here.
It would be. We only put the ones that had critical mass numbers on this page, so yes, they're actually instructional assistants on my big spreadsheet for them.
And then pre-K, we just picked up the expansion grant, and it's a 2-year grant. So at the end of this grant, and it's in the budget. So we don't know what the budget will contain. That they may re-up it, they may not. If the state decides not to re-up the budget, what would the status of the pre-K expansion classrooms be?
So what we built into here, we added 5 pre-K classrooms per year. So it wouldn't begin this next year, obviously. If the issue passes on the ballot, it would be the following year. We felt that was a number we could manage, but we could sustain as well. So soft money, which we're very, very accustomed to living with, and we anticipate we could do more than just the 5 classrooms with the soft money. So we weren't obligating our budget to those expanded. And it's nice. I mean, they're a cohort, and then they're gone. So if you're only able to offer, we have 53 early childhood education centers this year, so adding 5 more would be 58. If we got an expansion grant that allowed us to add, 2 more, and we had 60, but then 2 years later we had to roll it back to 58, we can do that. We also planned in our facilities master planning work to accommodate pre-kindergarten instruction in all of our new build elementaries or renovated elementaries. So we have the space, which is about a $433,000 consideration for a special or an early childhood education center. And then I believe the total for staffing is $177,000.
So Dr. Good, if you could quickly, the textbooks on here? Which are they textbooks all around, or can you describe? I remember being struck, I think, that there was some refresh that was
There is. There's refresh here. I believe this one is in the, so there's refresh built in here, so we lose a number of textbooks every year. The warehouse manages that, which is on the business and operations side of our organizations. We had to have a budget line for that, but it also includes textbooks on the regular cycle now for replacing textbooks, but they're not necessarily textbooks like we had textbooks. So a lot of times they're ebooks, a lot of times now they're able to be upgraded. The incident that occurred yesterday would appear in a new chapter that would be relevant for study next year. And so that's the beauty of the textbook world and the curse. It's put a lot of publishers out of business, quite frankly, because the current users can continue to refresh those texts in almost real time. Thank goodness.
So I think that one other thing before we go to that, back online, I'm wondering if you can, if we go to just to the options, can you tell us a little bit more about what's in and not in those options before we talk about?
Yeah, sure. So let's look at option 1. What's in that one, Stan?
Well, option 1, not to shortchange the discussion, but option 1 is not a viable option. It's the 5-year forecast that was developed under a whole set of assumptions that really wasn't driven by our educational plan and operations. So I don't think it's this is not the direction we want to go. This is not the direction you want to go. I can just tell you
So
right
this
now.
really doesn't contemplate, Stan, adding the positions that Dr. Goodges, so it's kind of a status quo run?
Yes,
Okay.
at best. And there's still, even under option 1, there's still a need for new operating dollars because that was generated with only 18 being slightly positive. So when you look on a longer term basis, to do nothing still requires you folks to do something. So I think all that Dr. Good had to say was relative to options 2, 3, and 4.
And option 1 actually had 39.5 positions in it, and I could go through this, but we don't need to do that. So that was, yes, and we shifted out 153 capital eligible expenses. So textbooks, computers, anything that had a shelf life of 5 years or longer, we can fund through capital. So we shifted those out. Option 2 was the aspirational budget, but spread over 21 years, or 21 years, 10 years. I'm not gonna live that long, 10 years. So So this one actually has all the positions we mentioned versus implementing in 5 years, we would stretch them across 10 years. That's always dangerous. We don't know what the district's really going to look like 2 years out, let alone 10 years out. But it was one way to, again, honor the input, understand that our target is to become the best district in the nation, world-class urban leader. And we believe that this could be done, but it would take a decade to do it. With whatever millage would support that. We also found an additional $63 million of capital eligible expenses up there. So we stretched it right to the line of what would be a capital eligible expense and there. And so we shifted those out in option 2.
And in doing that, but the shifting to capital eligible, that does, as I understand, alleviate pressure. It frees up more funding in the operating side. So we can put more into the that hands-on personnel with our students.
Or, yes, and or allows you to reduce your operating request.
Yes.
So,
Is there a benefit to doing that? So with long-term capital, the benefit of bonding is there, so you're spreading and amortizing over a longer period of time and reducing? Are we on this one, or are we just putting it in a different bucket? Is it the same dollars or just?
The former. The former. You've got your choice. When you get over to capital funding, you can either have a bullet up front, a bond issue up front. Even on a permanent improvement levy, we can borrow half of the 10-year revenue up front. So you can have a shot up front, but you have to have that alternative funding. You can't ignore $216 million worth of capital that we pulled out. So while we save in the operating fund, you still have to have that there, but it better matches the life of the asset, paying for it over time. There's a better match there. And again, it then, especially if you do it through a permanent improvement, at least a portion of it through permanent improvement, it then addresses this ongoing budgeting issue within the general fund, where oftentimes, as has been described around the table, you give short shrift to the capital improvements. Simply because that's...
It seems like you got two different issues going. One is framing it differently and calling it out as a kind of an ongoing, which may be more understandable and palatable, and then the other is there some advantage to long-term financing it?
Yes.
So if you're going to
Yes.
implement it over 5 years and you're doing a 5-year funding, it's neutral, but if it's got a 5-year, if you want to really load it up front and amortize it over 10, there's some advantage
You
to that.
can do that as well, yes.
It's a good point to bring up, because in a permanent improvement levy, you could go ahead and include staffing that do the ongoing maintenance. You couldn't include staffing in a capital bond issue. So that's why you have to think about this a little bit differently. Most districts have moved to having their own PI levy. I think Hilliard has a 2 mil PI now, and occasionally that will build up to a nice reservoir, but then a district can borrow against that for other needs. We don't have that currently, so we only have what was required in the new Facilities Commission with our newly built buildings and renovated buildings, and they require a half mil set aside for that permanent improvement.
And the 153 million, this does not contemplate the capital plan where you're talking about new buildings. And
It does not.
That's a separate conversation.
That's right.
This is just.
It's week 3, I think.
Yeah, and I think next week
So
we'll
these are
have a
permanent
little
improvements
overview
within
of
the
that.
operating historically.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
So option 3 then would be not waiting 10 years, doing it all in 5 years. And then option 4 would be pulling all those capital eligible items back into the operating. So the reason we thought it was important to offer that is we know that the board has expressed an interest in having their ad hoc's facility master plan segment 1 represented in an issue in November. Well, they haven't decided to do that yet, but it's certainly on the table. And again, that's going to, whatever's in that bond line will increase exponentially depending on which segments they choose to put in there. So we actually bumped all the capital back into the operating.
And option 4, because we don't have a PI levy, option 4 actually represents the budgeting conundrum that we're in. In order, if you ask operations to tell us what do we need in capital improvement needs, well, the only source of funding we have is in general operating. So this really represents that issue is option 4. And what happens is, if you don't have funds for option 4, what do you reduce? Well, you go to Maurice's budget and you cut back on the capital expenditures. So in order to have that aspirational budget under our current funding mechanism, it all resides here. That's how that works. Because what we're suggesting is there may be more palatable from a ongoing millage cost standpoint to finance those longer-lived assets over a period of time.
And 3 and 4, I think, provide kind of a good way to compare sort of some of the prior budget methodology. With 4 would be maybe how it was done previously, versus 3 demonstrated there is a different way to do it.
And as when, on the pages where you have numbers ascribed to it, it would suggest a significant extension of those, covering those capital investments over longer periods of time, right? And you got a big change there in terms of the millage.
Yes, you do, because you pay for them in 1 year.
So we could, if we
You
keep,
pay for them in 1 year. That's out of the general operating. When this $216 million becomes a 1-year expense here. In these options, they become either a 10 or a 30-year expense.
Couldn't you budget them to occur more sequentially, so you wouldn't fund it all up front, that you would do it over time and simulate that, or?
We could have that option. If you wanted that option, you could throw that $260 million in operation, but spread it out.
Stan, why don't we jump ahead to the slide that's this framework that has the millage amount, so we can start getting the committee oriented to what this looks like in terms of millage levels, please.
And we would love to budget that way, pay it all out of operating, but there aren't funds to do that. Inevitably, you run out of funds the way, because general operating revenues are flat. And then those expenses climb, and then those lines cross, in order to make ends meet, you've got to, it blows up your capital charge.
So, Tim, we did build the budget that way, so when Maurice put his plan together, it is over 5 years.
and when, for folks who aren't doing the budget, when we talk about Maurice Odom, you met Maurice last week, but he's the CO, so it'd be the operating budget, so the non-teaching budget, so all the operating budget, that's the Maurice budget. Just so everybody, we just remember, we need to kind of make sure we're explaining our jargon.
Yeah. So going to options 2 and 3 are roughly, Dr. Good, the same plan, but executed over different periods of time.
That's correct. Okay. Option 2 is over 10 years. Option 3 would be over, oh, I'm sorry, option 2 is, yes, option 3 is over 5 for personnel.
And option 4 adds in the facilities master plan?
No.
That's not
Option
reflected.
4
It's just how you
is,
finance it.
that would be no bond. Well, so option 4 is no, it's all funded through operating. I think the one, it would be like the prior budget process. Dr. Good then referenced, would that leave capacity for the facilities master plan?
Under a separate bonding mechanism?
Yes, that'd be separate.
Is there a maximum on the bonding that's doable? I mean, is there a reason not to do this with a bond and do the facilities master plan with a bond?
The only ceiling that might exist now, and Vice President Cole, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sorry, John, Dr. Stanford's here, he led the facility master plan, the ad hoc work. I think to do segments 3B and 3C, which are the only ones that have been recommended at this point, and the board's Neighborhood School Development Partnership Committee hasn't listened to those yet, would be the equivalent of around, was it 2 mils to do 3B and 3C? That would be the only, because they haven't approved anything beyond that. The ad hoc committee didn't. That's the only thing they've put together at this point as a recommendation. So that would be the only variable I'm thinking of. No, you're not limited in terms of bonding.
Oh, I think, Molly, I think it's just it was a presentation to show the comparison.
Yeah.
to make sure you can see it.
Our capital needs are coming from the way I looked at it, two different areas. One was the ongoing that we typically fund through operational, and then there's the facility master plan, which is huge, which is, it looked at a whole bunch of things, boundaries and grade configurations and the overall condition of buildings. And as an example, in the facility master plan, we may demolish a building and build a brand new one. I don't believe that's not what we do with these dollars in capital. You see what I'm saying? So there's two different mechanisms that we're finding capital needs in. Does that help at all?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to be clear, this 153 million under scenario 3, you would go out and do bonds for it, but they might have a term of 10 years so that you're spreading the payment out over a longer period of time and you're paying that back through the levy.
Right.
On the other one, you have 25-year assets for the buildings, the other stream, which is, it's just the same mechanism. You're issuing bonds, but you're issuing longer bonds, so you're amortizing it and paying it back with a separate issue, which is still covered by millage.
Correct. And there's also some, in here, because we left the option open for a bond issue is long, permanent improvement is shorter. We left more of a shorter pay-as-you-go process. We didn't divide that out yet, but we do know that we have that need. The pricing is all in a longer term.
And you'll have additional interest expense.
Yes, it's all, this millage here is all based upon a longer life asset.
So as Tim's pointing out on the two line items that say bond/PI, and then you go down second to the bottom line that says capital millage, that's what the millage level is for those items.
Yep.
Okay, so appreciate Stan breaking that out so we can see how this adds up.
Stan, can you explain what FY21 positive, just to clarify what that is?
In the model that we have to lay all this out, when we priced the millage in, the goal was simply to pull fiscal year 21 positive. And and doing it in 1/10 of a mil, some of the runs will get you to $1 million positive, some will get you to 3 or 4 million positive, but it was just positive. The minute you take that 1/10 of a mil off and it drops negative, we went up to the next highest 1/10 of a mil to make sure that fiscal 21 is positive. So that fiscal 21 is the last year of Scott's 5-year budgeting. He did 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. The latest 5-year forecast only goes to 20. The forecast won't deal with 21 until this coming October, although we have essentially done a quick revenue projection for that year so it aligns up so that we could do this calculation. But our goal here was simply to make 21 positive.
And then let's jump to the next slide too.
Yeah.
So then there's a question, and Stan and Scott work with the Finance Committee. Tim Robinson from Nationwide Children's, who just left, is on that committee. But in terms of fiscal accountability and responsibility, there is a question, as I understand, Stan, that is highlighted in the red, third to the bottom, that says 30-day cash balance. So can you walk us through the intent behind that, and then what it looks like from a millage standpoint?
It's a well-accepted industry standard, if you will, that a public entity would have a cash balance policy or a cash balance objective that, as I've said before, our target is not 0. And pretty much the industry standard is that you should have 30 days operating cash on the books at any one, at the end of the fiscal year. I use this as an indicator that when your cash balance is forecasted to drop below that, that's a signal that you need to do something. You need to adjust expenditures, you need to adjust revenues. It's a way of giving you it's kind of a leading indicator of not so good times from a cash balance standpoint to the company. So I've included the 30-day cash balance on my charts, but recasting what was on the previous slide to achieve 30-day cash balance at the end of 21 would yield these results.
So it's basically, if we currently don't budget that way, if we were to shift to this budget methodology, it would cost us a little bit more. So we need to build that in to the financing. But it's a way for everybody here to compare. So the option 1, 2, 3, 4 are all the same. But it's about adding that 30-day.
And just so you know, dollar amount, 30, and we do it on 30 days of forecasted expenditures. But it can run $75 to $80 million as a target. Versus when we ran just make it positive, $1 million was sufficient to make it positive, or 100,000 would be sufficient to make it positive. So that you can see that there's, over that 5-year period, we're generating probably $75 million more by the end of that year in order to hit that target. And that just requires some millage additional. So, I don't know, you take option 4 if you want, it's 13, but it jumps 2.4 to generate that.
Stan,
Yeah.
does that also assume investment during the year of any idle cash?
Yes, it does.
What's the current millage?
Good question.
Oh, you just had, I'm trying to, I don't know it off the top of my head. What, the current millage? Let me get that for you.
66.
Is that all in?
No, that's not everything, but that's the biggest portion of our group. 66 mils, like 78 all in.
And is that all continuing, or is any of it expired? Or?
It's all continuing.
It's all continuing.
And Molly, a great question. So that, so in that's what we're talking about here would add to that millage. Do folks everybody know what that, or if we need to delve into that? It's a great question.
And there's
Sorry, we didn't have a
voted
slide about
effective
that.
you've got to look at.
Steve, you want to talk about, I think the next 2 slides are important. These 2 slides show kind of the various opportunities, 30 days cash and not, for making this decision in 2016. If you recall last week when we talked about the forecast showed that by the end of 2018, we'd still have a little bit of cash in, much less than 30 days. It was just a couple days left. So, one thing the finance committee thought was very important to show is, do we absolutely have to go this year? And if not, what's the cost of waiting? Because as I think we've seen, the expenses that are upcoming and the needs that are upcoming, we're still going to need new revenue. So we do have, in making recommendation here, we can't think about, should we wait? So do you want to show what that would look like if we did wait until 2017?
Sure, and on the just makes 21 positive, there's the millage there.
The exact same things, but it just shows that it costs a little bit more.
Right. And then if you wait 17 and you want to hit 30 days cash,
so when the finance committee looked at this, and I know just personally when I looked at this, I thought this is a reason, because for a while I thought, well, if we can wait, we should wait. But then there is a cost to waiting. So I think this is something I think we can take back, and everybody can noodle on a bit between now and our next meeting. Think about, and I think it's real important for your thoughts to share with the board in this discussion. What do you think the community would support? From your vantage point, what would be supported, and what do you think about this?
let me throw one other aspect from a practical standpoint. Waiting till November of 17
and trying to address a potential deficit in 18 or that small of a balance in 18, we can't wait for that election result. There will be expenditure side issues that we have to address in 18 potentially. So it's not just, well, okay, we can wait, and if we get, you know, if it looks like we're going to end 18 with $5 million, okay, that's great, let's wait. Well, things can change. That $5 million, those variances can come in, and that can go away rather quickly. So if, just as me, as CFO, if you don't build the 30-day balance for revenue, you're going to have to build a 30-day balance from expenses. And that just destroys everything that we just saw on all the slides about program. But that's from a finance perspective. So keep that in mind. Waiting till 17, you're
The other thing I think is going to happen is we will be smart to do it with this election, with the number of folks that are going to vote, and I think we'll be smart. I think the other thing we got to figure out, and what I've heard here is you guys have figured out what was wrong, and you fixed it, and you're working on fixing it, and you need this to continue. So, I mean, there's no way you not do this. I mean, you've looked at from a business. I heard the business guys talk about, you know, the stretching it out, and you figured out how to get the buses now, and how to replace them, and how to bring more people in. I think this just makes sense. We have to tell the story, I think, as a community, and say, hey, they've realized what the problems are, and this is what they need to do now. And I think that's got to be some of our responsibility in this room if we go forward. And we were just talking, I think we both agree that this would be the best time to do it rather than the 17 because of the presidential election.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and this was, and Ron, a very fair point. Just from that fiscal standpoint, there are some folks, well, if you've got some money left, why don't we wait? And there is, I think that's why I think it's important to see there is a cost to waiting.
Well, and the clock is ticking on these kids. I mean, that wouldn't be fair to the kids now to wait another year. I mean, you know, these clock is ticking every day on these kids. I mean, and on our district. So we could get better sooner. Yeah. So when you make the decision not to move now, you're going to stay or maybe make some increases, but not the ones that you guys want to make. So
I think there's one other difference to note between if we go this year versus next year, because Stan will have to file his 5-year forecast before we would be on the ballot in 2017 or have passage if we waited till the fall. We're in a deficit sooner, which means I have to put together a reduction plan. So suddenly you're in a position, instead of saying this is what we can do, you're saying this is what we're no longer going to be able to do.
So even if it's on the ballot this November, you have to put together?
No, 2017, because we'll have a 5-year forecast again before it's on and passes.
And that's never good. I mean,
it's a threat then. You're perceived to be threatening your voters.
Well, and again, I don't think anybody's at the table arguing for 17. We wanted to give the committee a perspective of what it looks like. So there's clearly the political reasons, but just from a financial standpoint with the millage, you just hold your 2 pages up against each other. It's a significant increase. But Ron's point is really good. At the end of the day, it's about serving the students to the best possible way this community can. And Dan, what I see and what you walked us through is your plan, supported by the board, to serve the students of Columbus City Schools over the next 5 years or so through 2021. I think the question is then what's palatable from a community level. But I'll also remind the committee that from an audit and accountability standpoint, Ron mentioned the term mistake, which was last time around, the committee did not support the request. There were other issues going on in the community. So having the state auditor look at this district and say, you are on the right track is a huge vote of confidence in my view. So that's one check mark. The other thing that historically comes up is, asking the superintendent, where are you from an efficiency standpoint? Have you made the reductions that you've wanted to make and garnered the efficiencies that you've wanted to? Not to be pound foolish with it, but we're really looking at the go-forward plan, which has got new dollars tied to it. And I think the community needs to hear that all has been done that is possible to achieve financial security, but also from an efficiency standpoint that those measures have been put in place. And Dan, that might be something for the next meeting you could address, to be fair. Not asking you to do it in the next 7 minutes, but I do think from a committee we need to see what's been done under your tenure to achieve those types of accountabilities as well, if the committee would like to hear that.
That's good feedback. There's a great story. They've worked really hard on those issues. Why did you?
No, I mean, I agree. And, I was talking to the pastor this past week, and I think we've just got to figure out a way to tell the story. And I think we're building the story, but I think that's why I always like to say something in every meeting to let us, are we still on the same page? And we're learning more each week, but maybe our back crowd ought to be larger. Maybe the group doesn't have to be larger. Maybe the folks we have sitting here, maybe if we need folks to hear this, to tell the story, because that's what we're going to win. That the presidential election can help us.
Well, and that's we'll have the video posted. We had a schedule issue last week, but we'll have this meeting and the others posted too. But they're good feedback. Yeah.
I think as one who served also on the ad hoc committee, having that momentum of getting the feedback from the community could just propel this, into the positive as well. I mean, so it's like a continuum, and since they know that you're listening, you're concerned, you care, I just think this would just be another positive step for them to have buy-in, and we could frame it as such, that it's going to be benefiting everyone, like the ad hoc committee did with that particular issue.
That's great. So we're coming up for next. Stan, do you have anything else in your presentation for today?
No.
So I think for
I'm out of slides. Just totally out of slides.
Can we under these options see how much per 100,000 this translates to?
What is that per 100,000 stamp?
I'm sorry.
The various options, how much per 100,000?
That's on another spreadsheet, which I've got buried somewhere. I'll get that out though.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think it's important to see.
We've got that.
Bo, other thoughts on this material?
No, I think it was important for us to do our due diligence on understanding the financial implications of going this year versus next year. That can't just be an emotional appeal. We've done our due diligence here, weighing the implications of delay, and I think that will give the voters confidence, as compared to previously where there was, information that came out about additional funds that had not been accounted for, and I think that hurt our chances. So I'm glad to see that we've done our due diligence here.
So for next week, and thank you, as we'll wrap up, we will have, we'll talk, Chad, I think that's great feedback, and we'll start with a report on efficiencies and what's been achieved of recent, and I think the team has a great story to tell. And but that's to Ron's point, we've got to get that out there, and so let's do that. So we'll present that first. We'll also then have, we plan to have folks, including board members Gibbs and Preddy, come and talk about the facilities master plan. And the facilities master plan effort. You've read about that, to make sure you've probably heard about it from folks who are participated in the efforts. How does this, currently these millage amounts do not include that facilities master plan, and this is not a one and done circumstance, certainly, but we all felt like it was important to hear about that, and then also for folks, for all of you around the table to weigh in on what do you think in terms of, again, millage for this year. What will your friends and neighbors and constituents support? Or would they support, and if so, how much? We always want to ask for the moon for our kids, but sometimes we can't. We need to be measured about how we get there. So we'll talk about that, and then I think we'll also have some additional conversation. We can have some additional conversation about feedback you have on these millage amounts. Ultimately going to, if you think about the next 2 weeks then, because we will end on that our fourth Monday, so you don't have to get up at 7:30 to be here too many more times. But what we will want to do is, we'd like to ask, is that this group we could discuss through these issues and come up with recommendation, whether it's a single or option type recommendations for the Board of Education to consider. Because if you remember the schedule we reviewed last week, that the board will need to make those decisions sometime before the end of July to put a measure on the ballot. So your feedback and recommendations are vital to the board making, deliberating on those issues. So questions or thoughts?
I just want to say that Dr. Good is the champion of this group, and I've watched him all over this city. I said, when did he ever sleep?
Yeah.
Everywhere. So he's a good superintendent. This is rare in this day and age. I just want to applaud him for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor.
Make sure that anybody arrived after the beginning of the meeting, that we've had them checked off on the attendance list.
I've got all of them.
Yes, and I do want to recognize, I think of folks, board member Eric Brown did join us in addition, from our regular attendees, so as an observer, but thank you. So, gentlemen, anything else for the good of the order?
No, as a reminder, if anybody has questions throughout the week, shoot those to Stan, if you would, and we'll be sure to incorporate any comments, inputs for the next meeting.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. I think you can stand adjourned.